Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We're interactive in the United States. We get very upset by quiet. Quiet is disturbing. I have to admit, first of all, let's just clear something out of the way. I really hope, how many people here are planning on going to the protest on the 23rd of this month against Trump when he comes here for the World Economic Forum? For those of you who have not put your hands up, I really hope you consider coming. For those of you who did, I hope you not only come, I hope you bring friends. Because frankly, he must know that no matter where he goes, no matter what country he steps foot on, he will be persona non grata and treated with all the respect he most assuredly deserves. So, we will continue. Life in the United States of shithole. Let me give you a little mise en scène before we talk about the rise of the current feminist movement in the United States. Because I think there's really no way to accurately convey in words the trauma that is life in the United States over the last year since Trump was elected. Literally tens of millions of Americans wake up every single day anxiety-ridden, emotionally exhausted, and terrified by the rantings of a madman in the White House. Nothing in my 52 years of life, 34 years of them as an organized revolutionary socialist, could have prepared me for the political whiplash that is life over the last year. I say political whiplash because the dominant features of this period in the US are polarization and volatility. There is clearly a growing and hardening of the far right in the United States, but there is an even greater development in the opposite side, on the left, which I'll discuss in a little bit more detail as we move along. In sum, for more than a year, there have been spurts of anger and protests followed by weeks and even months of despair. This is not to say that things were somehow okay beforehand. They were absolutely not okay before. Today is the 12th of January? 13th? Je m'excuse. 13th day of the year. I believe, at least as of yesterday, the last time I looked at the numbers, 34 or 35 people in the United States so far this year, mostly black and Latino, have been murdered by the police in 12 days. It was the same the year before, it was the same the year before that, and it was the same the year before that. We are well on track to meet the usual number of somewhere around 1,000 people, again, mostly black and brown, murdered by the US police. So that is not new. That is not new at all. Living standards and wages have been declining for decades in the United States. Endless wars for oil and empire are absolutely nothing new. Islamophobic attacks and misogyny are really as American as apple pie and baseball. And never forget that the rise of Black Lives Matter did not happen against Trump and the far right in this country. It happened during the presidency of the first black man to assume the office in the United States, Barack Obama. However, what is different is that most Americans have never before lived under assault, daily assault on every front, all at the same time. That is very, very new. The mask, the facade that usually obscures the workings of our bourgeois democracy has been discarded. Before Trump, our ruling class used to politely pretend to care about working class people, used to politely talk about Arabs and Muslims sometimes, used to politely talk about black people and immigrants from all over the world, including from Mexico. But they did so while they slowly pitted us against each other, robbed us, and pursued policies that were utterly draconian in every conceivable way. Today, virtually every institution of American life, from healthcare to education to the trade unions, is being destroyed openly and unapologetically by a ruling class that is led by a racist, misogynist, fiercely ignorant narcissist who openly bragged about sexually assaulting women while he was running for office, Donald Trump. Let's talk a little bit about the status of women in the United States, because if we're going to understand the contemporary situation, the contemporary explosion, we should understand the backdrop to it in terms of what life has looked like for women. So let's start with those, frankly, on the bottom, and that would be our transgender sisters in the United States. I want to back up for a moment, because I can't take for granted that people are all aware of one central fact that we always must be. As with any political analysis of the US society, you always have to keep in mind that the United States is a country that was founded on the genocide of its indigenous population, Native Americans. You must remember that the US accumulated its wealth through the brutal subjugation of black slave labor. You must keep in mind that the US perpetuates that wealth through the ongoing violence against and expropriation of immigrant labor. All of this in a nation without universal health care, without paid child care, without paid maternity leave for either new mothers or fathers, nothing to support working class families, and forget about those who are at the very bottom, the poor. And I remind you of this because I think it helps to explain the rising intersectional approach that many people who are coming out into the streets and organizing for the first times in their lives have begun to at least attempt to absorb. The US working class today, the US society today is blacker, browner, and queerer than at any point in our history. So if you look at that, background of the United States, it begins to bring into focus the reality of the lives of trans women. And the fact is that even as transgender people have scored political victories over the last few years and turned public opinion in favor of more protections for trans people, violence against them has risen, especially against black and Latina transgender women. Nearly 30 trans women were killed last year alone. 1/3 of trans women live in outright poverty, 40% of all trans people have attempted suicide, and 30% have experienced homelessness at one point in their lives. As for black cisgender women, even after 8 years of Obama's presidency, 38% of black children live in poverty, most of whom live in households exclusively led by women. Black unemployment is still twice that of white unemployment in the United States. Keep in mind, the official figures of unemployment in the United States are complete and utter bullshit. They don't count you once you no longer receive unemployment benefits, and many workers are not eligible for unemployment benefits. If you are not receiving unemployment benefits, you are not counted as unemployed. If you work 2 hours a month, you are counted as employed. So the unemployment figures are utter nonsense. Even so, black women have twice that of white. And 55% of black workers make less than $15 an hour. The overwhelming majority of them, black women. There is no city or town in the United States where any family, really even any individual, can live any kind of decent life, even on $15 an hour. So when Walmart announces yesterday that they're going to raise wages from $10 an hour to $11 an hour, this is not something to dance in the streets over. And of course, they did so at the same time as laying off thousands and thousands of workers, right? And keep in mind, if you're making minimum wage, which is in some states $7 and change, right? $7 and change. You're not working 40 hours a week. You could be working 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 hours a week. So all of this must be taken into account. 40% of black women are victims of domestic violence. In fact, more than 30% of white women in the United States are victims of domestic violence. So the economic situation is undoubtedly better, by and large, if you compare for white women, for white working class women in the US. But we are all living in an era of social retrogression. The current decline in mental and physical health, from extreme obesity to the alarming rates of alcoholism, and now the deadly opioid epidemic, which is killing thousands and thousands of people across the United States, exposes the fact that we are living through what often feels like a dystopian nightmare. 40 years after the height of the women's movement in the United States, most American women face a truly bleak future. In fact, just before Christmas, President Trump signed into law a tax bill that throws a bomb at American women. The new tax law systematically guts benefits that support the women who need the support the most. It puts an end to tax exemptions for children, right? You used to be able to write your children off on your taxes, which will be a particular disaster for minimum wage workers, nearly 2/3 of whom are women. It sets an expiration date for a child care tax credit, and it denies these credits completely to immigrant children without the proper paperwork to show that they are citizens. It puts an end to student loan deductions. Keep in mind, this is in a country in which the student loan debt is now up to $2 trillion. $2 trillion. It is now the average debt that a student graduating from university is walking around with is at least $40,000, right? And of course, they're leaving college, even if you have an advanced degree, a doctorate, a master's degree, what have you, you are walking into what we refer to as a jobs desert. You are just as likely to get a job at Starbucks or whatever, right? With $40,000 in debt, and it's a debt that must be paid immediately. And it is the only kind of debt in the United States that even follows you into the grave. It follows you to the grave. You can even go bankrupt, right? You can fill out formal paperwork that you are bankrupt, which sets into process a means of excusing some of your debts, not with student debt. Student debt can never be excused. It is like a sort of 19th century, indebtedness in which I don't know, we will have debtors' prisons or what, but this is literally the scenario. And we, of course, are talking about people who are coming out with an education, who are educated. So this is not describing the situation of those at the bottom of society, but many people in working class and what would be perceived as middle class families. So this is what the economic atmosphere that this tax plan has come into. It is literally the largest transfer of wealth from working class people to the wealthiest people on the planet that we have ever had. It is an open and unapologetic act of class war by the rich against the poor. And of course, in order to pay for these tax cuts, they are going to eviscerate what is left of Social Security, Medicare, which is the health care plan for older people, for the elderly, disproportionate number of whom are women, and it will destroy Medicaid as well, which are the piddly amounts of money, the pathetic amounts of money that are given to the very poor, that some poor people are able to apply for that you can't get beyond 5 years, and then it's up. And then you're on your own. You live in the streets. You get a friend. You kill yourself. That's the American way. So that's pretty bleak. Sorry, I've depressed you all. But there's another side. There's another side. There's hope. There is another side to this dystopian picture. Don't jump out the window. The Women's March, the day after his inauguration, day after Trump's inauguration, obviously brought to the streets unprecedented numbers of people for an American protest. 4 to 5 million people are estimated to have been, not just at the protest in Washington, D.C., which clearly had millions, but even on the streets of small towns and medium-sized cities in numbers that people who are older than I am, who are old enough to have experienced the anti-war movement during the Vietnam era, say have not existed at that level since that era, since 40, 50 years ago. It's extraordinary. I mean, it was literally a handful of women, friends, who put up a Facebook page. And then within hours, tens of thousands of people, after he was elected, were like, yeah, I'm going. Yes. And then suddenly, people had to organize an actual protest. It couldn't just be a cyberspace call to action. And so, and they were rightly critiqued for not being inclusive enough of Black voices, of Arab voices, of Latino voices, of trans and other queer voices, but very quickly brought those voices into the conversation in the building of the march. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and it was an important start. Women and men alike mobilized to stand not only for women's rights, but we raised many other issues. Climate change, of course, climate change. Racism and police brutality, free speech and freedom of the press, immigrant rights and opposition to war, all of these issues were brought out at that magnificent day of March. I work at a union where we organize busloads of people to come, but that was actually unusual. Unions are now only less than 11%, around 10% of the public sector, and 6% of the private sector are unionized. And that is about to become much worse due to a decision by the Supreme Court in a few months that will, again, take a bat to the American labor movement. Most people organized themselves. They got in a car, or they got on a train, or they made some way of getting there. And the number of people who had not been political before, I know my next door neighbor in my apartment building in Brooklyn, who was not particularly political. She's a young mother who works as a secretary in an office. She got together with a couple of friends and organized buses from the neighborhood. She had never done that before. She had no idea how to go about doing it before. That was very, very typical of the way that action got organized. And it was transformational for many people. I have to say, as somebody who is a veteran activist, who has been to literally hundreds, if not, I don't even know, thousands of protests over the course of my life, I've even been at protests of 1 million people, the protests in New York in 2003 against the Iraq War, the month before the bombs began to fall there. But nothing was anything like that protest in DC that day. I could not move an inch, and that was common. You could not, for hours you were standing there, you couldn't go to the bathroom, you couldn't move, you couldn't walk. If it had been any other circumstance, I would have been terrified by the crowd. But because of the spirit of solidarity, the reason we were all there, the camaraderie, the humor, frankly, that people brought to that protest, you didn't feel afraid. You felt you were there with your sisters and brothers, because you were. And I have to say, it will go down as one of the happiest days of my life, because we walked away feeling hopeful and that something was going to be happening that could be different. And it set a tone for what's possible. And more importantly, it brought back to the forefront the notion that collective action is crucial. Collective action is crucial, if not actually to win immediate gains, because it's not as though, the next day we got women's liberation. Bullshit. We didn't win anything the next day. What it was, it transformed us. it brought back onto the agenda and introduced to a new generation a new element on the agenda, that protest was possible, that protest was necessary, that protest was a way to actually defeat the isolation that we felt and begin to have the debates and discussions that were not happening in American society, and gave people a voice in talking about the sexual assault, the rape, and of course the rampant economic inequality in the United States between men and women. I do not believe that the current Me Too moment would be conceivable without what happened about a year ago with that march, that began with that march. Because you have to remember, Me Too is not a movement. There were no marches in the streets for Me Too, or the ones that happen are quite small. It's an idea, it's a moment in which, you know, I don't think anybody honest could have ever predicted that that would happen. And it set the tone for what happened a few weeks later when Trump announced a ban on Muslims to go into effect immediately. People by the thousands and even the tens of thousands mobilized to the airports. And not just JFK in New York. I'm talking about airports in like Louisville, Kentucky and Columbus, Ohio. People, both an element of spontaneity and then very often, as are many spontaneous actions, individuals who've been politically organizing for some years, talking about these things, helping to give shape and channel the sentiment and give it a direction. And that's what happened. Even the taxi drivers in New York went on strike. Taxi drivers are not unionized in New York. Well, they're unionizing. They are largely immigrants themselves, disproportionately people from South Asia, from India, from Pakistan, from all over the world, of course. They struck thousands at the airports, and end of Muslim ban. That was it. Of course, they've had to reintroduce it a number of times. Within weeks after that, there were protests demanding sanctuary for immigrants, in particular the 800,000 children, people who came here as children without legal papers, who were being threatened with deportation, right? On the college campus, the university campus where I work, protests in the thousands happened one after the other to stop the Muslim ban and to demand sanctuary for immigrant students. Protests of that size on that campus, again, had not been seen since the Vietnam War era. Nothing like that had happened, frankly, in my adult life, certainly my conscious life. And so, and a few weeks after that, some largely women of color, mostly socialists connected to international organizations like my own, the International Socialist Organization, the Fourth International, and others, put out a call for a women's strike on International Women's Day, a holiday in the United States that goes largely unknown and uncelebrated. Now, it did not lead to mass strikes, I wish, in my dreams, perhaps soon. But it did lead to small actions, and it did raise the conversation about a strike weapon as a possibility. Strike levels are at historically low levels in the United States, but to the degree where there have been strikes over the last years, generally speaking, the strikes that have been dynamic and that have won have been nurses and teachers. What do these two have in common? Largely female workforces, many of them women of color, in particular in the healthcare fields, leading the way in terms of a fight back in the workplace. If you look specifically at the Me Too moment, it, honestly speaking, ignored the enormous role of black women in creating both the legal and activist framework for dealing with sexual harassment in the US. Tarana Burke, who was a black organizer who first coined the Me Too phrase back a decade ago to sort of give comfort to other women who experienced sexual assault and violence of various sorts as a rallying cry. But those early 2017 marches actually laid the groundwork for a broader critique of women's oppression in the workplace. And soon, shortly after Hollywood women came out with their stories of sexual abuse, right? You're talking about some of the wealthiest women in America, obviously the most famous women, sometimes in the world, largely white. We're getting solidarity from largely farm workers, brown, Latino women. This is a message that Latino farm workers sent to Hollywood actresses back in November. Sort of bizarre. I'm going to read from it. They said, "In these moments of despair, and as you cope with scrutiny and criticism because you have bravely chosen to speak," this is a letter from 700,000 Latina farm workers. "Because you have bravely chosen to speak out against the harrowing acts that were committed against you, please know that you are not alone. We believe and stand with you." Interesting. Fascinating, actually. Women hotel workers in the city of Chicago, again, low-wage workers, often women of color, many of them immigrant women, have pioneered a hands-off, pants-on campaign to combat rampant sexual harassment and assault by hotel guests. Their demands include access to panic buttons for anyone working alone, and members of the workers' organization for restaurant workers, which again, in the United States, restaurant workers who are the people who serve the food, especially in the lower, in the regular restaurants, not the rich restaurants, it's waiters, it's men. But in the regular restaurants, in the cheaper restaurants, in a diner or whatever, it's almost always women who are waitresses. And they have come out to demand a fair wage. Just so you know, you ever travel to the United States and you eat out in a restaurant, the person who is serving you food does not earn a wage. They do not even earn minimum wage. They survive on the tips that you give them. So tip well when you go to the United States. It's a demand. Can you believe it? In the 21st century, people are making a demand to get paid for work. It's obscene. It's obscene. And yet that is normal in the United States. Again, even the farm workers in Florida, the coalition of Immigrants workers, have made demands for higher pay and for decent conditions and practices to eliminate, or at least to alleviate, sexual assault in the fields where the world's food is picked. In just 1 month, last month, 6 members of the US Congress have been forced to resign over sexual assault allegations. And that list is likely to grow much, much greater. The Washington Post and CNN have said that there are now investigations on somewhere between 30 and 40 other members of Congress. So they will not be the last to fall, quite possibly. So, if you think about it, and actually I should say this, after the farm workers sent that message of solidarity to the wealthiest women in the United States, who are Hollywood actresses, the Hollywood actresses have responded now in these last weeks by setting up a $13 million fund to help alleviate and help prosecute legal cases and show solidarity with these women. Now, I have no illusions, I don't think you should have any illusions, that Hollywood wealthy women are going to be at the forefront of a workers' struggle for, against racism and for workers' rights in this country, but it shows you something about the sort of coloration, about the tone, about the sense of solidarity that, at least in this early stage, exists out there. And it will also, I believe, soon show the limitations of that kind of solidarity. Because as we know, when wealthy women and poor women are in movements together, it winds up often being those with the greatest wealth and with the biggest megaphone whose rights are protected, while others are often tossed aside eventually. And as with any other struggle, Me Too is also under attack at home. And not just from the right. What is most daunting, I believe, what is most aggravating, is that many liberal women, most but not all white, have begun to push back against Me Too, calling it a sex panic, right? That turns women into perpetual victims and men into perpetual predators. Naturally, the far right in the US is all too happy to exploit that attack. But I believe that the biggest challenges that we face in the United States right now, not just around the rise of a sort of feminist moment and movement, but in all of the struggles, is that there is an enormous gap between consciousness and organization on the left that is explicitly and unapologetically independent of the Democratic Party, which for decades has been the graveyard of social movements. So I want to say a few words before we talk about where I believe, at least, this radicalization is going. Where to from here? I think we have to remember we're at the very beginning. We're at the very beginning of developing the kinds of networks and organizations that will be necessary to take on the US political establishment. The far left is still quite small. The organization I am a member of, the International Socialist Organization, is the largest of the revolutionary left, of the Marxist organizations in the United States. We are, 1,000 or so. However, we see the growth, the enormous growth of the social democratic organization known as the Democratic Socialists of America, many of whom became inspired by the Bernie Sanders campaign, which we'll talk about in a moment. And that organization went from really a few handfuls, thousands of people with maybe a few hundred activists to 30,000 members in the course of just a few months. And all of us, whether you're talking about us on the far left or people slightly to our right, perhaps, we all collaborate together, we work together, we organize together in forums and discussions and reading groups and all of these kinds of things. But that organization largely has both mobilizations on the street, but also I believe the majority of those members are quite young, quite raw, and I believe harbor illusions in the possibility of taking over the Democratic Party and bringing it to the left. A project that has failed every single time it has been tried over the course of the last century, and in fact, each time it has been tried, instead of dragging the party to the left, those activists have been co-opted or smashed. Those are the two things that have happened when leftists have gone inside of the Democratic Party. So we face these very, very, very real challenges. I think the other thing we face is the lack of organizational continuity from one period of upsurge to the next, right? The American labor movement was born through sit-ins and mass strikes, general strikes, in the 1930s. That generation was wiped out in the 1940s and 50s. Many of the people who led those strikes were communists, socialists, perhaps anarchists of various stripes. They played central political roles in giving expression to a sentiment, but giving leadership and organizational direction to these strikes and actions that actually won enormous transformational gains in the United States. The New Deal, all of these things were not because, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a nice man. He was a member of the ruling class, and unapologetically so. But they were threatened, their profits were threatened, and they needed to make concessions to American workers. But just as there was no continuity between the generation of the 1930s and the generation that next exploded in the late 60s and early 1970s, there is again today little continuity between the last generation and the current one of rebellion. And these are real problems. We cannot imagine them out of existence. We can't belittle the significance of them. But the desire to become an activist, especially among people under the age of 30, is very, very real and more widespread than in decades. The idea that you need to become organized and that you need to have a set of politics and that you need to put forward a set of demands against the structures of power are things that this generation is beginning to understand, especially because the Occupy movement just 6 years ago, which was dynamic and exciting and transformative in terms of talking about class, the 99% versus the 1%, a crude but nonetheless very real class discussion that happened, did not lead to transformations in policy because there was no organization, demands, or structure to that movement, and it could be smashed. Smashed, I might add, by Democrats in cities where, in cities that are almost invariably run by Democrats. So Right now, polls in the United States show that 50% of people under the age of 30 oppose capitalism. Now, that doesn't mean that 50% of people in their 20s are suddenly revolutionary socialists with a Marxist understanding and a whole program and none of it. But it means that the conversation is happening. It means that people are reading books. It means that people are crowding into rooms like this one to hear what people who are organized socialists have to say. And these are debates that are quite real and quite widespread in the United States. And so I think really, in closing, the resistance to Trump is really hard to predict. And the character of it is both sporadic and not sustained. This is really, we have to remember this whiplash that I described. You go through weeks of feeling like anything is possible, and then he puts out a tweet and he does some stupid bullshit like yesterday where he refers to all of Africa and Haiti as a shithole, and people go into despair and don't know quite what to do other than, make jokes and memes on Facebook, which is clever, but obviously not about to bring down the American ruling class. So I think we have to understand that what is happening is at a quite primitive level. But it's very real. It is not to be dismissed. And I believe that we have big challenges ahead in the United States and globally. Because let's be blunt. Let us be honest among ourselves. Trump is not the problem. He is a symptom. He's a symptom of the crisis of global capitalism. If the American ruling class, which I believe would much rather have had Hillary Clinton running the show, if they wanted to get rid of him, they would have gotten rid of him. They are fine with him because ultimately, as crude as he is, no matter how misogynistic and narcissistic and racist and disgusting a pig that he is, nonetheless, the American ruling class is getting what it wants. It got its tax cut. It's making record profits. They are doing just fine. And so I think we have huge political and organizational questions that we have to confront in the United States. And it has never been more important for people to get organized, to develop a level of politics, and to begin to discuss strategy. Because if you just have struggle, but no politics and organization, you cannot win. And if you just have politics, but no organization and struggle, you will not win. If you do not have all three, politics, organization, and struggle, you will lose. We are all facing those questions. And that's what I hope we can talk some more about here today. Thank you. Genuine radicalization taking place in the United States. And as primitive as the politics may be, and they sometimes do really feel quite basic, there's an expression in the United States that mostly younger people use, but to put it bluntly, shit just got real. It's throughout my life as a Marxist. I come to Marxism in many ways through Palestine. I'm Jewish, my family, I was raised a Zionist. I went to Israel after high school and before I started university, and I went there a Zionist. Now this is back in the early 1980s, before the wall, blah, 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 and was horrified, frankly, by what I saw, but very confused and not very well educated about the history. Or I had basically drunk the Kool-Aid, as we say, or I bought into the lies and the mythology of Israel's history. And when I returned, I was quite fortunate to meet revolutionary socialists in Chicago, where I was going to university. I grew up in New York. I live in New York now, but I went to University of Chicago. And I met Marxists on the street, in fact, outside of an abortion clinic where we were defending the clinic from attacks by the right wing as women were going in. And I asked them questions if they knew anything. I had just returned from Israel, Palestine, and I asked them questions about what they knew. And they immediately put in my hand Edward Said Noam Chomsky, and Karl Marx. So I was recruited to Marxism by two Jews and a Palestinian, and have never looked back. And in that time, since 1983, when I first became radicalized myself, I have never experienced this degree of seriousness among such a large swath of people in the United States. And I am accustomed throughout my life of being part of this or that solidarity movement. People, in solidarity with people of El Salvador, or Nicaragua, or, in solidarity with people of Palestine, in solidarity with people of Haiti, and in solidarity with all sorts of social movements, and in opposition to all sorts of wars, and racism, and police brutality. But never before have so many tens of millions of working class and middle class, which is really working class people, been so profoundly impacted by the devastation that is taking place in the United States. It has been taking place over decades, but it's like, at some point quantity turns to quality, right? At some point water becomes steam. You turn the temperature up high enough. And we are now at that point where our lives are so deeply affected. This is not just about, I am in my 50s and could well be facing unemployment myself in not that far from now, given what is about to happen to the American trade union movement. There will not be well-paying jobs with benefits at the other end of the line for myself and tens of millions of people like me, if that happens. And so we are now in a fight not only in solidarity with other people around the world and with other people in our own country, but we are fighting for our own lives. And nothing makes you more sober than having the prospect of really dire circumstances in your immediate future or in your immediate present. And so it has added a degree of seriousness to the search for politics among many, many people. And that's why you can see the sort of significant growth among groups like the Democratic Socialists of America, which of course is going to be the first recipient of large growth because people are unlikely to go from being sort of progressive, socially progressive and economically progressive to being Marxists overnight. Very few people do that. A few of us made that journey, but we are unicorns. Mostly people need to see that the usual paths to change, the Democrats, for example, or a protest, are not sufficient, or actually are counterproductive in the case, I would argue, of the Democrats. So I think people are on a journey right now, but this is not a childish journey. There is a sobriety about it for millions of people because the alternative is so awful. And that also lends itself to many possibilities that I think it's important we not foreclose what direction it will go in. Again, nobody would have predicted that thousands and thousands of people would mobilize to the airports to stop the, people from being banned from the country because they are from the Muslim world. Nobody would have predicted that tens of thousands of people would hit the streets in solidarity with their immigrant neighbors to stop deportations. But this is happening. Frankly, I certainly would not have predicted that #MeToo and women speaking out about sexual assault. This is not as though this is new. After all, during the election campaign, we actually had Trump on tape saying the things that he said. Grab him by the pussy, blah, blah, blah. And so I think we have to remember that there's a lot of known unknowns out there. There's a lot of things we do not know, and it's important not to just presume that things will just go as they have and things will be, predictably miserable as we carry on. There is a long history in the United States of consensus by riot. There will be explosions in the United States. Of that, I am 1,000% certain. Oppression and exploitation have always bred resistance. And so the question is, what will be the character of the resistance in the coming period? What will be the political demands and organization of that resistance? And what will be the response of the American state? And I really caution folks here to looking to things like the next election cycle as being our salvation. Because I cannot emphasize enough to you the reality of how we got here. Trump won because the Democrats refused to fight for anything that real, ordinary people need. 8 years of Obama meant we had 8 years of lovely speeches. 8 years of a lovely gentleman and his beautiful family. But symbolism alone is not going to put food on the table and give you a job and pay the rent. And it should not be forgotten that it was Obama who deported unprecedented numbers of immigrants. It was Obama, not Trump. In fact, Obama outpaced where Trump is at right now in terms of deportations of immigrants. So all of the crass and disgusting rhetoric that is coming from the White House and from the Twitter sphere aside, if you remove the facade and you look at the content, and you look at the structure of what has been happening to American society and American capital and the lives of women and the lives of the majority of Black and Latino people in the United States, these things have been getting far worse for decades, and most of that time we have lived under Democratic presidents. And it's just important to grasp that. It's not because I want to put an equal sign between the two political parties. Again, there would be no reason why any working class person would ever vote for a Democrat if there was simply zero distinction between them. But the political policies, the economic policies of the Democratic Party have failed women, have failed Blacks, have failed working class people. And that is why we are in the situation we are in. So, Obama was elected, let's remember, during the recession, at the height of the recession, with an expectation of, a New Deal, of a mass jobs program, of all of these sort of extraordinary things. It's not simply that none of those things were enacted. It's that things actually were set in motion, including bailing out the banks without any money for working class people, in particular Black people, who lost more homes in that crisis than anyone else. And Black women, most of all, thrown under the bus by the Obama administration. So people can talk all they want about how lovely it was to see the Obama family in the White House, a house built by enslaved people. But we cannot thrive on symbolism. We have to live on real policies and real progress and real change, and none of that was delivered. None of it. So right now, what I think the hope is in is not in the midterm elections, or God help us, starting the campaign for 2020, but in the social struggles that are beginning to develop and the left circles that are beginning to become a little more sophisticated. And I have to say, one thing that is happening, which is very new and very wonderful, is people are reading. People are reading. Naomi Klein's No Is Not Enough book is a bestseller. A dear friend and comrade of mine, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who wrote From BlackLivesmatter to Black Liberation, as well as a book that's out there, How We Get Free, is now a known entity among millions of people, is interviewed, and thousands of people come out to hear her speak. Even a person like myself and other comrades and people on the left come to give a talk or a speech on a college campus or in a neighborhood or what have you. large numbers of people coming around. People are grappling. People are wrestling with huge questions about what to do next. And so this is where the hope lies, because people are in motion. And when people are in motion, there's hope. And when people are exploring the questions of solidarity, which is really what the intersectional discussions and debates in the United States are about right now, then people are on the road to actually moving ahead instead of just being paralyzed. But I do believe we are likely to see explosions that will not necessarily be led by any one or multiple organizations. And some of those explosions will be in a healthy direction, and some, tragically, will not. But it's better for people to explode into action than to remain in paralysis. And that's where I think the hope lies right now. I'll shut up and you can ask some more questions or disagree with me. Disagree. I could be wrong. I could be wrong. To look at where some of this is coming from, at least in terms of the United States, I want to preface this by one thing, and that is a misperception has been promulgated not only internationally but domestically about the vote for Trump. The majority of the people who voted for Donald Trump, and keep in mind, again, almost half the population didn't vote, and then of course he didn't win, and then he got half of that, so you're talking about somewhere around 25% or 28% of the population or something like that voting for him. So the majority of the people who voted for him were not these sort of quote-unquote white workers. The majority of the population who had voted for him were white middle class, were petty bourgeois. If you look at the median income of his voting base, it was somewhere in the mid-$74,000, $75,000 a year for a household. That would be considerably more, actually, than workers in the United States would earn. It would be people more in the managerial class and what have you, which is not to say that there weren't workers who voted for him. There were workers who voted for him, who were willing to either agree with his racist, misogynist filth, or were willing to look past it, which is, frankly, just as frightening, and vote for him, including many women, which is also something like, gulp. There's women who voted for him. And there are even 28% of the Latino vote went to Trump, shockingly enough, even after he said the things that he said about Mexican rapists and on and on and on. So I think there's a couple of things to be said about that. Number one is, when you are inside of this prison of a two-party system, the element of throw the bums out is profound. And by that I mean, when one party is in power and it doesn't deliver the goods, then the obvious thing that people do is they switch to the other party to throw the bums out and get in the new one, because that's the only other option. Or, as many people did, you just simply sit out the election. So it wasn't simply the case that one year, millions and millions of people, tens of millions of people voted for Obama, and then the next election, those same people switched over to Trump. That switchover was very, very marginal. It was real, but it was marginal. Much more so were people who just simply couldn't tolerate either and sat out the election. But in terms of this very real element of people who are, who agree with his grab them by the pussy, treat women like filth, be utterly denigrating toward people around the world, and in particular blacks and Muslims, that has a real resonance in the United States. I wish I could say that were not true, but when you have institutional racism on the level that you have in the United States, including under the Obama administration, right? Where black and brown people are treated so disrespectfully, are humiliated on a daily basis, and are paid significantly less, and are kept out of housing and jobs and education, is it surprising that people then harbor all sorts of stupid ideas and racist ideas about black people, which is why the Black Lives Matter movement has been so profound in the United States, because you see how people going to struggle can shift the consciousness, because after all, consciousness is not a fixed thing, it can be a fluid thing, and it's often shaken out of complacency by struggle. And so with a mass struggle, many white Americans became deeply aware for the first time, I wish it were not the case, but deeply aware for the first time about the extent and depths of racial oppression and racial killing by the police. Same can be said around the issues of sexism and really overall misogyny and institutionalized, oppression of women. There are a significant percentage of women in the United States who have benefited from the legacy of the women's liberation movement of 40, 50 years ago. Some 20% of women are solidly in the upper middle class or even rural class, right? Oprah is probably a rarity out there, but there are people who are making significant incomes and who are in that level. And yet the majority of women who are facing systematic oppression on the job, lower wages, we still don't make anywhere near what men make, and even less so, of course, if you're a Latino woman or a black woman. Black women literally have zero wealth in the United States. They have negative wealth, in fact, in the United States. It will be a step up for many black women to have zero wealth. Most are in severe debt. And so I think the toxic masculinity can be attributed, at least in part, to the structural realities of the way American society is formed. You do not have this level of inequality without, of economic inequality, without the sort of social inequality that goes with it, right? So in a country without paid childcare, and in a country without paid maternity leave, and in a country without universal health care, who does this labor? This is labor that is largely done by women in the United States. And with increasing numbers of women in the workforce, right, even that sort of social reproduction, right, the work that goes into producing the next generation, and childcare and housework and all of that, even that now is paid work. Who does that paid work? Not men, largely it's women, paid much less money under very precarious and contingent conditions with few or no benefits. And so when people are officially treated worse, the perceptions of them become that they deserve less, that they are deserving of less. And I believe that especially, there's a certain aspect of sexism that I think we have to see not as an expression of men's power over women, but of working class men's powerlessness over their own lives. It's not about, oh, poor men, but it's about acknowledging and describing a reality. When you have little to no control over where you live, what your education is, your wages, your future, and all of these questions that most Americans have no control over, it is always easier to kick down than to kick up. To kick up, you have to be organized, because it's hard to kick up, right? Gravity works against you. Politics works against you. Power works against you. It's always easier to kick down. And so you look at those figures that I gave you earlier of domestic violence, 30% of white women experiencing domestic violence, 40% of black women. What are those expressions of? What explains that? Are these expressions of husbands or boyfriends or fathers' power? Or in some distorted, sick, disgusting way, is this an expression of powerlessness over one's own life and the feeling that one has to and can take it out on someone weaker than themselves? It's not to excuse it, but we have to be able to explain it. We have to be able to describe it if we're going to fight it. And so I think part of the importance of the rising feminist struggle in the United States, and it is by no means well organized, or even organized for the most part. It is a sentiment that floats out there that has momentary expressions that are organized and then seem to disappear and then seem to reappear. It's like pressing on a balloon, and it comes out here, and you press over there, and it comes out there. I think that these begin to challenge ideologically, but not yet structurally. Because structurally, we haven't seen real structural changes. We've seen some men lose their jobs. We've seen some powerful men be humiliated. But we have not seen structural changes yet in the United States, and until we see those kinds of structural changes, I believe that we will not see, women getting any sort of real fundamental relief from this kind of toxic masculinity that I believe is bred by a system that feeds, that thrives, an economic system, let's name it, a capitalist system that thrives on inequality of every sort and requires inequality. How else could it run? How could you have a system run by a 1% against 99%, to use the Occupy language, unless they pit us against each other? It's so basic, and it works. It works. That's why it's used. It works. It's very effective.